Okay, so I'm going to slap this at the front of the video, but this is actually after I've done a full talk. So we're going to take the recap at the end and we're going to slap a big old P on the front of this and make it a pre-cap. So what we're going to cover in the video today was what makes a game, and basically what I'm starting with is the basics of what I think a game is, or what makes a game. So we ask the question, what makes a game? And we talk about mystery, emotion, and interaction, which we'll get into. I kind of go bit by bit and we arrive at these three. And then we determine that there's three basically different types of games. So there are competitive, co-op, and solo. As well as three others that I didn't list here, but you have like your traditional games, your board games, and your video games is sort of like the three main mediums that games are expressed through. And then we get into your role as a designer. We briefly touch on flow state and frustration in design. We get into ideas a little bit, but I ran out of time, so I'm gonna. We touched on it, but we're gonna build on that in the next video. So with that is your brief pre-cap. I hope you enjoy the video, and I will see you in a second. Okay. Alright, so I wanted to start off with the basics of what I see as like the kind of foundation for video games, or not video games, but just games in general. Starting off with what is a game. And my handwriting is terrible, but whatever. we'll roll with it. So what is a game? A game is basically anything that you can interact with as a player for entertainment. Interact with for entertainment. And I think that for entertain, nice. Anyways, I'm not even gonna change it. All right, so I think what people find entertaining is like basically some sort of mystery, and they want to not know how an outcome is going to happen. So like with like football, like a traditional game, you have two teams and you are, wow, what even is that? Two teams, and you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and that's why like gambling is so interesting for people, I think, is because you're basically placing bets and you're choosing sides, and you're trying to, or you're watching the game to see what happens, and there's tension because if you choose a side, then you're vying for what the outcome is going to be, and that gets you invested, and then you get the resolution of the end of the game, which just gives you sort of a catharsis on knowing what the mystery was. And so as far as like games to play or like be involved in, like there are let's just say there's three types. So there's like traditional games are more of a competitive thing. Then you have co-op games where you are working together. So basically, like if you were on the team working towards an end, and then you have solo games where you're playing by yourself and basically either trying to top yourself or top your, I don't know, just like some obstacle. So that's, like swimming, for example. You can technically be racing other people, but most of the time you're competing against your previous best. So like speed running would be a good example. And so that's sort of the core of like how you can break down the different types of games, and then as well as like understanding why people are coming to these things for entertainment. So I think that leads into the two different formats of games, I guess. Well, okay, so I was originally thinking just board games and video games, but bringing in like the football, I guess there'd be like IRL games or just like traditional games, video games, and traditional. Oops. Wow, handwriting's real garbage today. Apologies. So I have the most background in board games. Traditional games, I don't think I'm going to get into as much, but I think that is something to like keep in mind. That's like, more like sports. And so that's going to fall into, that can be drawn on and implemented into these, but and basically what I'm getting at is like there's like the competition side of things. A lot of like physics-based stuff, like just seeing how a ball is going to react, and there's just like the universe that we live in is a really cool physics engine to play with, basically. So I don't really like, trying to make a video game that is the sports, like the FIFAs and the Maddens and stuff like that. Because it will never really capture what you get out of sports from actually going out and physically playing them. Anyways, I'm getting kind of tracked into a sideline here. So these are the mediums that you can kind of express a game through. And I think that board games are kind of like the next step down from a traditional game, and this is going to be more of like an in-person. Technically they can be solo, but I think most of the time you're going to find board games are built for a small gathering of people. So these are going to take the competitive and co-op side of things as sort of like your front running methods of interaction, and video games are basically going to be able to do anything that a board game does, but they have a wider scope because you're allowing the computer to do a lot of the heavy lifting that limits what a board game is capable of doing. I think there are strengths to board games over video games, but as far as mechanics go, video games are going to be able to basically replicate anything a board game can do. And I think what really separates video games from board games is their ability to handle the solo game very well. So on top of the mystery side of things, you're also looking for an experience from a game. And so the thought is that like you're doing like people are often playing games to pass the time, and so you want to have something to kind of talk about, or like say that you've done something or something interesting happened. So I find that this is a good core to build a game idea around, because if you can leave people after playing a game, saying like I I experienced something. Like, there's in like books and movies, so like narrative. In narrative, there's the like show don't tell rule. Oops. Show don't tell rule. And I think what games are good at doing is being able to show, but they do it in a different way. And what I mean by that is they put you in the shoes. Like, you're able to immerse yourself. Yeah, let's go with immersion. So you're able to immerse yourself into the role. Oops. The role of a character. Oops. Character. And because you're the one making decisions in a game, you're able to identify more with what the thought processes are that go into the choices that, like, let's say a character that you're watching makes. So so basically, whenever you're creating a game, the very base is going to be what you want your player, what you want your players to feel at the end. And this doesn't have to be anything crazy. It can just be like, I want them to feel like a badass. Like a badass. Oops. Or, you know, like they're smart. Jeez. It's so weird writing with a tablet, because it's like I'm so used to writing on paper. Anyways, doesn't really matter. It's just there's a weird disconnect. So yeah, so you're able to communicate feeling through games in a way that I don't think other mediums are particularly well suited for. And so whenever you're coming up with an idea, whenever you're coming up with an idea, you want to kind of boil that down into what is the emotional experience you want somebody to feel. Whatever, we'll just do experience. You want the players to feel. And so, like, I have a prototype for a game that's you know, like robot fighting, and like that was basically the whole boiled down idea to it. Is I wanted, you know, to have a way that you could, you know, make custom robots and send them out to go blow up other robots, and I just turned that into a 2-player board game. Well, technically multiplayer, but it's the base game is 2-player. But that is the emotional experience is what you're going to be able to leave a lasting impression on people, and if they enjoy the emotion that it elicits, they're going to come back to it, because people don't really remember details too well. they won't remember, like, I mean, people who play certain games over and over and over again, who are very familiar, can kind of slot in details that have been really ingrained into memories, but for the most part, people are going to remember the way that they felt during something. So using that to your advantage is how you should go about coming up with an idea, or like deciding if an idea is worth pursuing. And honestly, I think that any idea could be a good idea. Like, there's so many things that you can express through the medium of games, because it isn't limited to something that you need a story to tell. You don't have to follow a narrative structure in a board game to make people feel like they're a badass. So if that makes sense. So basically, like, you could make a game about, literally anything, but as long as you're getting to an emotional experience and using mystery to engage the player, and basically what I mean by that is, randomness, or just a lot of mechanics kind of interacting with each other to create to obscure the outcome of an event. That is going to draw people in, and if the resolution of that mystery leads to an emotional experience of some sort, you're going to have a game that feels more impactful. And I think that is all I want to say on that. And so we will move on to another section. So from there, I think I want to talk about, I guess I kind of covered this, but basically what your role as a designer is. And that, I guess we'll just recap what I talked about, because it's basically you're trying to balance the feeling of, or you're trying to balance that emotional feeling along with the mystery. Mystery. And you need to balance the, like, engagement of the player. And engagement, I don't know if that has the E there, but we're gonna roll with it. So what I mean by engagement is the actual act of using the game, how the player actually interacts. Maybe interaction. Interaction. So that is like the way that the player plays your game. So the rules, the difficulty, the aesthetics. Oh, I don't know if the aesthetics really comes into it for the emotional. Well, yeah, I guess it does. Because I guess in this talk, or in this series, I want to talk about like the full scope. So the aesthetic would be like the visuals, and if you are doing a video game, the audio and things like that. So the way that it visually looks is also going to play into it. But basically, you want to manage the frustration level of the player, and that's fairly difficult And that's where iteration comes in, and that's why people talk about that so much, because you want it to be there's a if you're unfamiliar, there's a term called flow and flow state, which is basically where you are managing the bounds of, well, okay, so experiencing flow state would be like you're meeting a challenge that is just the right difficulty for your brain to fully engage, where you just kind of lose your sense, or like your body kind of drops off everything else and you're solely focused on what your topic at hand is. So I think it's really common to talk about this with Tetris, because back in the day what kind of caused this idea to surface was people that would play Tetris, and they'd be so in the moment of trying to make everything lock into place that the people who would really excel at that were the people who entered this sort of flow state where they're just kind of letting stuff happen. And so what you're trying to do as a designer ideally is to get people into or close to a flow state where they are feeling sufficiently challenged but not overwhelmed. And finding that line in between those is what the flow state is. And it's very difficult, like, so this is where you need to figure out your target audience and things like that, because like something that is challenging for a 12-year-old is going to be different than something that's challenging for a 20-something-year-old. And so, and even within that, it's like, okay, is your general audience member going to, you know, like, I'm a big fan of puzzle games, but I know that things like The Witness are overwhelming for certain people, and same thing with like RimWorld, which is another really fun game for me, is extremely obtuse in its presentation, but I enjoy that challenge, and I get into these flow states with that. But it's very, like, it takes a certain kind of person to really get into that, and a lot of people end up being overwhelmed by it. So it just depends on what kind of person you're trying to appeal to. And on that, I would say appeal to yourself. Because, well, at least appeal to yourself first, because one, that's the person that you have the most experience with, and you want to be building something that's fun for you, but then as you progress, you want to get other people to play it, ideally other people within your target demographic, so that they can help you define this flow state line, or this frustration level. And so that's kind of the interaction side. Like, that's the bound that you're trying to hit on that point. But then you also, like we had talked about, you want to, you know, design something that gives you an emotional feeling and provides some sense of mystery. And so kind of like the emotional feeling should be kind of like your core idea, and that's just boiling that down. So whatever your idea is, you just want to get to the base of what is the reason or the feeling behind that. So, like, I gave the example of feeling badass, but you could go in the complete opposite direction. You could do something where it's like, you want a game that, you know, just is relaxing and fun, or, you know, relaxing and tranquil, and, or no, let's not go from that angle. Let's go from, like, taking experiences you've had in the real world is another is a really great way to come up with games and to guide your core design. So like a really popular one, or at least a one that I think is interesting, is the guy that designed Pokemon, and I don't know his name offhand, but the original idea for that was that he, or let's just write Pokemon down. So for Pokemon, it was he wanted to recreate the feeling of collecting bugs and making them fight, which is something that, oops, it's too many bumps for an M, making them fight. So collecting bugs, making them fight. So anyways, this is something that like he had a strong attachment to, and it's something that, you know, most people, well, I guess I know for sure with bugs, my sisters were more into catching lizards, but I think that kind of falls the same thing. Like little kids like to, you know, just collect things, and I think the, you know, with the making them fight thing, that's something that has been around in humanity for forever. Like look at the Colosseum in Rome. And so like that's the thing that he wanted to recreate, which he had an emotional attachment to, and it kind of like defined how he went about building that game. And then the fighting aspect brings in that mystery. So like I had said before, mystery would be anything like just having an unsure outcome. And so in Pokemon, it's a lot of different stats and values that kind of obscure how a fight's going to go out, but it mainly comes down to level versus level, and you're not sure what the next trainer's going to have. So there's a lot of mystery that gets resolved periodically through that. There are a lot more details to all of this stuff that we can get into later, but I think that's about all the time I'm going to spend on this for today. So I'm going to, I don't know, I didn't want to empty this stuff, so let's do a recap, and then I will make this into a little pre-cap for the start of the episode. So just a general recap. We had what makes a game. What makes a game? Question mark, with game very loosely written here. And so what we arrived at is some sort of mystery, an emotion, and interaction. And on top of that, we have three different types, I guess we'll just call it. So we have competitive, co-op, and solo. And then talked about flow state / frustration. Oops. Frustration. And that was covered underneath your, well, actually, that was underneath your role as a designer. blah blah blah. Okay. And we kind of touched on ideas. Oops. But I think, jeez. Yeah, we touched a little bit on ideas, but I think we'll come back to that in the next episode. Let's just write down ideas here. Kinda. Okay. So I hope that you found this interesting, or at least useful. I know it's kind of rambly, but that's just kind of what works best for me. And yeah, I actually really enjoyed getting through this. So I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one, guys.